Welcome. Welcome to this webinar on sustainable diets. Welcome from Northwest Europe, from China, from Southeast Asia. Good afternoon, good evening. We will have today a webinar on sustainable diets for almost 600 people who have signed up for this and who have a background in nutrition and health. Well, I am Professor Pieter van Veer. I have also been educated in nutrition and health, and I now hold a chair in nutrition, public health and sustainability. And today I will especially inform you about sustainability. I'm working at the Division of Nutrition and Health at Wageningen University. And since 5 years, I'm also working in the field of environmental sustainability as related to nutrition and health. When we talk about sustainability, it's always good to first think about what we mean with that. And sustainability seems to be a simple word, to sustain something. But what we want to sustain or want to make sustainable is life on Earth. We want to secure it is sustainable. And in 2050, not in 2010, as this slide says, we have 9 billion or maybe 10 billion people, but just one globe. And the United Nations have therefore formulated the so-called 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goals that we should achieve to maintain a sustainable Earth, a sustainable planet for people, for current and future generations. And many of these sustainable dietary goals are sustainable development goals are related to food, nutrition and health. And I'm quite sure that you have seen some of these sustainable development goals before. Poverty has to do with sustainability. Hunger has to do with food. Good health and well-being have to do with food. Sustainable or circular consumption and production have to do with it. Water, life, the use of the earth, etc. Sustainability is quite a wide concept. And what do we mean when we talk about it? Well, there are in fact two definitions on sustainability. One is the narrow definition, which in fact relates to environmental protection. Then we talk about issues like the greenhouse gas emissions, the use of land, fossil fuel use in this carbon age, use of nitrogen in agriculture, phosphorus, water, acidification of the oceans or of the seas or of the rivers. Things like that are all in the domain of the environmental protection, environmental sustainability. As related to what you see here in these three circles of the Sustainable Development Goals, the part of the biosphere. But there are also broader definitions, and those are the definitions that the United Nations use, where they say it's not only the environmental sustainability, so the carrying capacity of the Earth, related to the issues I mentioned before, but it's also the social and economic part. And the social part includes health and dietary quality, the socioeconomic disparities that we see all around the world, but also within countries. And that have to do with, for instance, the affordability, can you buy your food, either, and the global disparities as well in countries. Well, we know there are big income differences in the so-called high and low and medium income countries. But there's also another economic component which has to do with the livelihood of farmers all around the world, with the food security, the production volumes, trade, transport, logistic, availability and access to food. So, and that those three components, environmental, social and economic, they are all part of the broader definition of sustainability used by the United Nations. For the presentation today, I will focus on a specific, specific definition of sustainability. That's where sustainability relates to the diet. And FAO in 2010 has defined a sustainable diet as indicated on this slide. And they are those diets with the low environmental impact. You heard that before, that's the environmental side. That contribute to food and nutrition security. There we have the economic side, I would say, and to a healthy life. And there we have the nutritional and health side. And then the specific thing for sustainability is that it's not only for present generations. When it was only for the current generations, we could talk about public health, but it's also about the future generations. And the future generations really brings into the aspect of sustainability, because sustainability is sometimes defined as a solidarity of us as current generations with our future generations. And when you think about sustainability from these three angles, then sustainable diets have been defined as diets that are protective and respectful of biodiversity and ecosystems. You might label this as planetary health. They are culturally acceptable, accessible, economically fair and affordable. This has a lot to do with public health. And they are nutritionally adequate, safe and healthy, which has to do with the nutritional health or the personal health. And they do so by optimizing natural and human resources. And that makes it quite interesting, because here you see the same three dimensions as I mentioned in the previous slide. The personal health and well-being for me and my family, the personal side. The public health and equity for all people, the solidarity with current generations. And in the right lower corner, the planetary health for biodiversity and for the future generations. So you see all three dimensions, from a very small individual to the global, but also from the current to the future. And in the middle are the foods and diets from our environment. But you can hardly, or it's hard to combine the three objectives to have both personal health and public health and planetary health at the same time. There are trade-offs between the three, and we have to decide and to think about which one to weigh most heavily. And I think there is one of the key challenges of today when we talk about healthy and sustainable diet. So that brings me to the end, in fact, of my introduction, what we mean with sustainability. So that's done. And in the remainder of this presentation, I will first go into how a sustainability diet looks like, just to give you an idea what types of diet we're talking about. Then I will go into the food system, because diets, we get them from our food system. And then I will go into the topic of the synergies and trade-offs that I just mentioned. And then I go back to the food system, in fact, because we have to realize that what we eat comes from our food system. The food system sets the table. But maybe, and that's a more recent thought that we are developing, we could think about the consumer setting the table and steering the food system rather than the other way around. And then I will conclude with some final remarks. So how does a sustainable diet look like? Well, this question was really put on the table a few months ago, at the beginning of this year, by the Eat Lancet Commission, and they defined a sort of global reference diet. And they said, well, if you think about these definitions of sustainability, we like to have a diet that is nutritional adequate and that can be produced within the planetary boundaries, within the carrying capacity of the Earth. And they came to this figure, and you see the circle with the 100%, that's the recommended diet. And the segments that, well, go far beyond the 100%, and some others are less than that, are the average current global diets. And what they concluded was that, yeah, on average, there is large variation in caloric intake, and we need to get to the optimal caloric energy intake that fits to your body size and composition and physical activity. We have to reduce then, on average, on the global scale, the added sugars and red meat. So this is an average. I stress that. I come back to that later. We have to think about a diversity of plant-based foods and little animal-sourced foods. Use unsaturated fats rather than saturated fats, and have limited amounts of refined grains and highly processed foods. and the intake of fruits, vegetables, legumes and nuts should be doubled. So this was the advice of the Eat Lancet Commission, and below the slide you see a link to documents of this commission, which you might go over later when this is available on the web. Here you see another representation of this Eat Lancet Global Reference Diet, and you'll see on in the table in the middle the different food groups that they have distinguished, and you'll see that they are quite rough food groups at a commodity level almost. And of course they have also more refined data, but it's also you can only make a global overview when you have data on that level of detail. And that means that at the global level we only have quite crude data. So that's where they had to work with. But based on that they came to these diets with certain macronutrient or macronutrient food intakes in grams per day. And you'll see, for instance, for the whole grains, they came to 232 grams per day. But if you look at the tubers or starchy vegetables below, they say, well, 50 would be recommended, and we eat much more nowadays. But they give a quite big range around it, indicating that the solution for what is sustainable might be different for each specific situation. And therefore they also made some nice pictures on how these diets might look like at different places in the world. And of course you can go over the link and the information in more detail to have a deeper look into this. Here they have labeled the same diets, but now they have shown here it's shown in a bar graph, and you see on top the red meat and the starchy vegetables and the eggs and so on, the different food groups. You also see the 100%, so this is what we on average would need to do to stay within the sustainable and healthy diet limits. And you see quite sure that is clear that the current diets, that's the height or the width in this fact of the bars, that for red meat they are far beyond the 100%, but the different bars show that makes a difference whether you look global, which is the red bar always, or whether you look at East Asia or the Pacific region or South Asia or North America. It's different everywhere, and it's very important to take that into account. Some countries need to reduce drastically their red meat intake, while for others regions in Southeast Asia, you see there would be room to increase it. As long as, on average, we stay around or within this 100% range. And I think it's very important to realize that it's not one fixed diet that everyone should eat, but that there is a wide range of solutions. Because what we eat differs everywhere in the world. You probably have once seen these nice pictures of Pieter, where he collated a number of pictures where people showed what they eat on a weekly basis with their families, and you see how much it differs all over the world. And the data where Eat Lancet makes use of, as I said, they are quite crude. So what we did in Europe, we had data available from 4 countries in a similar way, collected in a similar way, but these were not data on the production or the per capita intake data, but they were intake data at an individual level. So based on 24-hour recall data or diet records. And here they are, we see an analysis of the energy intake versus, on the vertical axis, the greenhouse gas emissions. And you clearly see the more you eat in terms of energy, the higher the greenhouse gas emissions. So the first thing is there is a positive association between greenhouse gas and energy intake. And the total energy intake that could be explained, or I should say the total greenhouse gas emissions that could be explained by energy intake was 38%, given country and gender. But if you would look at a certain level of energy intake, then the variation due to the food choice in different countries at the same energy level, that's in fact the type of variation that is independent of our body size, composition, and physical activity. And that has to do with our dietary choice, our food choice. And that's where I would like to focus on most of the time in this presentation. And what this figure shows is that in these 4 European countries, and I should mention them, they are Denmark, which is, we would say, is Northern Europe, Scandinavia, Czech, which is the Central East European region, Italy representing South Europe, and France representing more or less the west of Europe. So we have some heterogeneity, and we see here that the greenhouse gas emission expressed in carbon dioxide equivalents per day ranges from 4.4 to 6.4 kilograms per day per 2,000 kilo for a 2,000 kilocalorie diet. So that really shows that food choice matters quite a lot if you compare these different countries. And if you integrate the information on what we see as sustainable diets, there are 3 basic principles, I would say. The first is reduce the amount of foods intake or adapt it to your energy needs. It does not always mean reduction. That depends on the population where we are. But at least reduce food waste and don't eat too much. And how you can do it, I made use of what our nutrition center in the Netherlands said, but that typically holds for a Northwest European country and population. You could make use of shopping lists and week menus, not to buy too much, so that you don't store it too much. You should look at best before dates, but better trust your nose. When it smells okay, you can probably eat it, and so on. Store your foods properly and wait and measure before you start cooking, because otherwise you throw away, you might do too much. We're always afraid that we do not give enough to our children, but maybe we should measure and just give them what they need. So that's one part, the amount of food, which is related to the energy part as well. We should shift to foods with a lower environmental footprint. I come to that back later, but the diet would then contain less red and processed meat, especially beef is very important then. They should have less processed meat and cheese on bread and increase plant food. So that's a shift in the dietary choice, even when keeping energy constant. And the social environmental aspects come in when you start accounting for food source and season. So choose foods with the low footprints, but that also could imply that you, at least in Western countries, think about the seasonality of the production, about the way of transport. Sometimes we fly in some foods here by plane, which is very ineffective and from the viewpoint of greenhouse gas emissions and CO2 production. And we could think about fair trade, using fair trade products or specific certified products. And of course, this type of fair trade or certification depends on the country where you are, what is the best way. And here I could only mention those for the Netherlands. So when we talk about diet, we have to think about where does our diet come from? And it comes from our food system. To have a sustainable diet implies that we need to have an environmentally sustainable food system. And our food system is not sustainable as it is now. And there are 2 key reasons for that. And they are related to each other, but in some sense also independent. One is population growth. We are going to 9 to 10 billion people by 2050. On the left, you see the growth rates or the population sizes in time developing for the world, and especially large growth is anticipated in Asia and Africa, while in Northwest Europe it remains almost constant. And at the same time, we are aware of the trends in the global temperatures, the climate change as well. And these 2 together put a big stress on our food system, which we see in a number of issues that are mentioned here in words below, but you could make this list much longer or shorter depending on your interest and your favorites, but they are all related to these 2 aspects of the global warming and population growth. Well, global warming is related to the greenhouse gas emissions. I think that's something that we know from the IPCC panel, that this is quite sure that this is a key reason. And when we look at the production of greenhouse gases, we see that in the orange part of this diagram that 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions comes from agriculture, forestry, and other land use. And then when we think about the food system, there's also a part on all the buildings we have in the transportation and the industry. If you would add that up and add that to the system as a whole, because it's part of the system, then you see sometimes estimates of 25 to 33%. So a quarter to a third of our total greenhouse gases are related to the food system. But again, like in the diet, there is a considerable and large regional variation. So there is variation in the greenhouse gas emissions, but there's also a variation in productivity around the world. And when we relate that to climate change, there are calculations where projected impacts of the climate change are made for the yield from agriculture. And this figure shows you the regions in red where it's anticipated that the productivity will decrease in the future. While in the green areas, and in the dark green especially, productivity is likely to increase. So there will be a production shift relatively to the north countries. And this will have a negative impact on the economic growth and migration, at least in the red and orange labeled regions. And it will have adverse effects on the delta zones near the seashores, where many peoples are living worldwide, and that are very relevant to production of food as well, because of the sea level rise that might occur. So the climate change also affects the food production and the sustainability of the food system. Well, I already mentioned before the planetary boundaries, or the carrying capacity of the Earth. This is a figure by Röckström from Nature, and he shows a number of factors that have to do with the environmental sustainability of the planetary system. And you see in the middle top climate change. The green area is, say, the carrying capacity of the Earth, and when it's beyond that, it's above the carrying, exceeding the carrying capacity of the Earth. So that holds for climate change, that holds for the nitrogen cycle, and nitrogen is key to protein production and proteins in our diet, and it relates to biodiversity loss, say the biodiversity of the species all around the world. So those are the main critical factors with respect to the planetary boundaries. And now we are at the point of thinking about, when that's the carrying capacity of the Earth, how does that relate to health and to socioeconomic factors? So we now have to think about the synergies and trade-offs. And this is a picture by, I forgot to mention the name, by Kate Raworth, who presents the donut of social and planetary boundaries, as she calls it. And she says we have to think about a safe and just space for humanity, where we can live as a human race. And on the one hand, we have to account for the environmental ceiling, say what has been proposed by Röckström in the previous slides, but we at the same time have to ensure a social foundation. We have to ensure health, enough food, enough water, income, education, gender equality, social equity, and all those things. In our research in Wageningen and in Europe, we have labeled the letter to this as a so-called, what we have called a sharp diet, which is sustainable, where the S is for the environmental part. But the diet should also be healthy, the social foundation, affordable. You should be able to pay it, to buy it. It should be reliable, secure, you should trust it, and it should be preferable. It should fit to your culture. Well, these three things I will now explain in a little more detail. We use this as a symbol: healthy people, sustainable environment, and socioeconomic fairness, affordable, reliable, and preferable. And I will illustrate this in the coming slides, starting with sustainability and giving that relatively a bit more attention, because that is the new aspect and topic of this presentation. Environmental sustainability, how do we know what diets are environmentally sustainable? Well, that's based on what we call LCA, or life cycle analysis. There are also other methods, but this is the most frequently used method to assess environmental sustainability. And then we look at the life cycle of foods. They are produced, distributed, processed, purchased at markets, prepared, consumed, and we have waste, which might go back to the food system. And the indicators of environmental sustainability are related to this food life cycle. And the impacts it has are on global warming, biodiversity, forestation, eutrophication, acidification, etc. So we have indicators and we have impacts. When you calculate such indicators, I have here a list of 2 indicators for a number of food groups: greenhouse gas emissions and land use, for 17 food groups. And then you see green, which is the plant food groups, yellow, the animal food groups, and blue, the vegetable food groups and other, the drinks, I should say. And just as an example, I've used here the milk and dairy products in the Netherlands here, I would say. And you see that greenhouse gas, then you have 11.5 units kilogram of CO2 per kilogram food as eaten, so almost 12. You see the same figure, but then it's a different unit for the land use. The other things in red are the figures that are higher, and you see the higher figures are for fish, fish products, meat and meat products. And also for land use, meat and meat products are higher than milk. Eggs and egg products are higher, and animal, vegetable fats and oils are also higher. So the others, and especially in the green domain of the green food groups, they are lower. And I think that's the background that we think we need to make a shift from animal products and to more plant products to solve or to contribute to keeping the planetary boundaries. And that's why we think about this shift. For the 4 countries I mentioned before in the Netherlands, we used the individual level diets to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions per 2,000 kilocalories and the land use density also per 2,000 kilocalories. And here you see in the bars what the emissions are and the land use is for the 4 countries. On the left, greenhouse gas; on the right, the land use. And you see the same pattern, in fact, in the countries. These measures are to some extent related. But I would like to focus here on the red part of the bars. That is the part of the greenhouse gas or land use that is related to meat, fish and eggs. And the blue part is for milk and cheese. It's still a big part, but considerably less. And then you have the fats and oils. And on top, you see small contributions of relatively small of grains, fruits, vegetables, beverages, and the other food groups. So again, this shows that also given the food choices we make, that the animal products are quite important. Well, for a consumer, maybe that's not very helpful. Consumers think maybe more in meals, how they use them on a diet. So here we see it for the Netherlands, not for one of those 4 countries. But here it says that in our avondeten, which means our dinner, which is the third and the highest column, in our dinner we produce most of the greenhouse gas emissions. And there also the largest part is from the meat products, fish and eggs. So again, from the animal products. And if you would look here at the red bars, they are the milk products, excluding cheese in this case. And you see, we as Dutch people, we use them both in our breakfast, in our lunches, at the evening, and even in between the meals. So that is typically something which is for the Dutch eating culture, but that might not be globally applicable. And figures like this or would look differently in all countries. And it would be relevant to know how these figures look like in all countries, to see what changes could be made that realistically are realistic to consumers as well. So after these slides on sustainability, I would go to health. And for health, we have here a representation of the global burden of disease, a Lancet 2016 publication. And this says how much different risk factors contribute to the global burden of disease. And on top you see the diet risk factors, and the big blue part in between has to do with the cardiovascular disease. The pink red part is diabetes, and the green part on the left are the neoplasms, so the malignant diseases. So that's how it looks in a Western diet. It will look different in other countries, of course. Western countries, but also many other countries, have developed food-based dietary guidelines to see how they could reduce such the non-communicable diseases. And here you see some of these guidelines, but here we have only selected those that we used in further modeling of the diets in these European countries that I showed before. So that's the health part of the sharp diets, as I talked about. Here we go to the affordability. And I show some figures on disparities in health. On the left, you see the under 5 mortality rates by socioeconomic status in 4 countries. And you see in all 4 countries, Indonesia, Brazil, India, and Kenya, that the poorest fifth of the country, the poorest 20% in the country, has the highest mortality rates in children under 5, while the highest quintile of the population has the lowest rates. So this is the socio-economic diversity within countries, and it's huge, a factor 2 to 3 in mortality risks. But also when you look at Northwest Europe, you see still large disparities in health. On the right, you see the level of education in men and women, and the life expectancy that people have when they are at the age of 60. It's about my age. And you see that people, depending on their education, have still 10 to 15 years. I look at the men now on the left figure, have still 10 to 15 years healthy life, and 17 to over 20 years of life expectancy, but then part of that will not be as a healthy life. And for women, these figures are slightly higher, but you see a clear relation to the educational level, which has to do with income, with access to health care, but also with making the better food choices. So in all situations, the social dimension is clearly there. The affordability plays a role. Then we have reliability. I mentioned before it has to do with food security, etc. In the Western countries, it has a lot to do also with trust consumers have in the food and in the food system. Is it safe? Is it fair? Is it secure? Are we sure we have something to eat tomorrow? And we tend to say here that consumers can vote by the food choice they make, what food system they would like to have. But that's not the complete truth, and I'll come back to that later. There's also a corporate responsibility of the big food industries. The food choice, the diet, and the environment are all part of our food system, and they relate to our food choices as consumers, to our health, and to the environment. And at the same time, the public health, the global environment, and the environment where the consumer lives in, the food environment, depends what we or determines what we eat. And we have our own preferences. This figure shows from a consumer survey whether people would be willing to think, to change, open to change their dietary choices. And on the left, you see that in 5 countries, the Netherlands and the 4 countries I mentioned before, people are quite willing to think to move from one type of animal products to another type of animal products. That's above what we would call a neutral score for this. When we ask them to whether they're open to move from animal to plant products, you see a quite lower score. People are more neutral, so they're more hesitant to do that. And we ask them, do you want to change to new products like insects, which is not in our food culture in Northwest Europe, or try new products? They're even more hesitant to do so. So this shift from animal to plant products or even new products is not an easy thing. And probably we might start learning from each other on a world scale on what options we have for alternative diets that might be more sustainable and still are quite healthy. Another aspect of preferability, of course, has to do with taste, if we look at consumers. We did one study based on the Dutch dietary pattern, and we selected diets from a diet survey that are either healthy and sustainable based on indicators like greenhouse gas and indicators like nutrient densities, or that are the least healthy and sustainable, and we took the extremes of this, and then we scored all the foods for their taste profiles. And then you'll see that the most healthy and sustainable diets tended to be sweeter and more fat, more sour, and quite a lot of neutral tastes, so not very tasty, while the less healthy and sustainable diets have bitterness, are more savory, have more umami taste, salt taste, fat taste, what people tend to like. You could also say the right least healthy and sustainable diet may be the diets that most of the time adults prefer, while on the left it may be diets that children, when they are quite young, still like and prefer. But when we grow older, we start liking the other type of diets more. And it will not be easy to make changes and change our dietary and preferences, our taste profiles. Well, when these are requirements or factors that play a role in healthy and sustainable diet, we have to realize that it's not just the consumer who chooses, but it's the food system that provides our food. And the food system is driven, well, by a food supply chain, and there's a lot of economic interest, relevance of this system. Farmers are involved, the food industries, the retail catering, and in the end it's the farmer. And sometimes we tend to look at it as a linear system. And this system produces all these issues like the land use, the water use, but also the health issues, malnutrition, obesity, NCDs, etc. But the system is not only a production system, it's also an economic system with outputs at the side of the biodiversity and inputs in the land and fossil fuel, etc. And what it does, in fact, is it makes use of geographical differences in production of agri-food products, producing environmental impact at different places in the world, and then by transport, industry, etc., and going to the retail and to the restaurants, etc., it leads within countries quite often to socioeconomic disparities. Some foods you can produce quite cheap, but they are the best available to people with the lower budgets, weekly budgets, while the more expensive foods can be bought by people who have more to spend on a weekly basis. So we have socioeconomic disparities in the production side, and we have socioeconomic disparities as well in the consumption side. And it has a lot to do with the power of that is in the supply chains. This is for the Netherlands. On the left, we see in the Netherlands we have 65,000 farmers. On the right, we have almost 17 million people. But if you look in between, we have only 4 or 5 big retail companies. And there is where the power is. And if you would make a figure like this with farmers on the world and agriculture commodities, you would also see that there are 5 or 6 or 7 great players, large players in the international commodity market that govern a lot of what happens in the food chain. So to some extent, it's the food chain that is these big players, they are in charge of what's happening in the food chain. But there is also a feedback circle from health to the food chain. I remember very well that as a nutritionist in the 90s, we realized that trans fatty acids modified by the industry were very important for cardiovascular health. And when that became quite clear to everybody, it was possible by a big fat company like Unilever to change their industrial processes in a week or so and replace them by other oils and fats so that trans fats were removed. And this has led to a big reduction in cardiovascular diseases in Northwest European countries. What we did not realize at that time that in longer time period, this has also contributed to the increase in palm oil plantation and plantations and land use in other places in the world. So our gain in health in the end appear to have an inverse or adverse effect on land use in other places in the world. And nowadays we are thinking about changing from a high meat diet, and you see here a milk cow, but in fact we should talk about meat cows to start with. When we change that because of environmental reasons, we cannot do this by industry alone, but then it's also the consumer who has to make different choices. So now the consumer is much more in charge, because with the fats and oils, companies like Unilever could change that without even the consumer noticing it. But if we're going to leave out our meat from the diet or replace it by plant foods, you cannot do this without the taste and affordability issues that are relevant to consumers. And we need also to think ahead that in the long run, we do not create problems with respect to health. We know that if you go to extremely low meat diets or animal products, that we might run into problems with vitamin B12 or with calcium or with iron or some other micronutrients, which have impacts on anemias. So that's why I use that picture. So we have to think about our short-term interventions, but also about the long-term effects that we do not see immediately. And that's how the systems are related to each other. But is it the system or is it the consumer? And I must say that there seems to be a sort of disconnect between the short and long-term feedback loops that I showed before. We have short-term feedback loops when we think about consumer behavior, your energy feedback loops, isocaloric exchange, physiology, that works in terms of days. Preferences in terms of meals. Your budget maybe in terms of weeks or a month. And your times, convenience, technology, your knowledge and skills, preparing of foods. Well, that's probably something works on a daily basis. How much do I have time do I have today to prepare my food? So there are very rapid feedback loops there. But when it's about health, our own personal health, the feedback loops are much longer. You think about risks and avoiding risk in terms of years. When it's about public health, it's even more distant from us as individual people, and planetary health is at a far distance. The latter three are more at a system level, while the short-term feedback loops are at the individual, the consumer level, and our daily choices. And the challenge is to connect these two levels with each other. And I showed before, and we do this with mathematical models or trade-off models to make trade-offs between health and sustainability of diets. And the Lancet Eat models was based on commodities produced on a global scale. You also see quite often data or models based on at a level of foods as people consume them, based on national surveys. You see levels more based on diets as a whole, like vegetarian diets or a pescatarian diet or a vegan diet or a flexitarian diet or just a traditional diet, and people compare what's the impact of those different diets. And we have been working what we have called, as I explained before, a diet that is both sustainable, healthy, and affordable, reliable, and preferable, which it fits to the consumer, and it also takes into account the short-term feedback loop. And if you go from the bottom to the top of this pyramid, the diets that are produced by these type of models are increasingly more realistic from the consumer point of view. So we would like to have diets modeled in what we would call a sharp way. And when doing that, we always find out that it is quite hard to incorporate those consumer level preferences, budget, time, etc. And we use data like records, recalls, food frequency questionnaire, or food balance sheets, and we would like to have the most refined detail. But we always run into trouble with comparability of data from different countries, and especially when we look all over the world. We also run into problems with nutrient composition tables, food composition, the nutrients in it, but the same holds for footprint data from different countries. And especially when we look globally, that's quite hard to get comparable data. And one thing that's in a lot of models ignored is that consumer behaviors, the menus we use, there are many interrelationships in the dietary behavior of consumers, which has to do with the budgets, with taste preferences, with the skills they have, etc. And they are not taken into account by most of the models, mathematical models. They are taken into account by eminence, by expertise opinions, etc., which I have mentioned above. But the models, they have their weaknesses, they have their problems, but they also have a particular strength that if you have been able to develop such a model, they are reproducible, they are widely applicable in different contexts, provided we have the data, and they allow us to compare on an honest way what the food systems and the diets contribute to health and sustainability in the different countries. And nowadays we have not a good basis for comparison and make fair decisions that hold for both national or European or regional and global systems. And that's the challenge we have to face, and that links to the global dimension of food production and food consumption cultures. And we have thought about how could we arrive at diets that take into account both health and sustainability, as well as make use of our experience as humans to have different and varied diets. And this figure shows the relation between dietary components we would like to decrease because of health reasons. So you could think about the saturated fats, you could think about the red and processed meats because of relations with cancer. You could think about, on the vertical axis, dietary components we would like to increase, like fruits and vegetables or certain vitamins and minerals. And in the left upper corner, when you are below a certain level of components you like to decrease, and above a level of those you want to increase, there you have the real healthy diets. But the healthy diets, as you formulate in that way, and has been done by the Eat Lancet Commission, are some way far away from what we actually observe. And this ellipse type of figure shows how diets we actually use might look like with respect to the components we would like to decrease or increase. And when we have some observed diets, the open dots, you might say we might change them in one direction or the other direction, and you get a green space. And these are say, all other diets that do better on one of these two dimensions than the diet that this person at a specific place has. And in that way, we have been looking at national diets in the 4 different countries, said how can they do better, making use of the experience or the dietary examples you have in a population. So identify best practices within a diet within a population for healthier diets. And based on that concept, this sharp concept, we said, okay, what are the healthier diets? We used the data of 8,000 people in these 4 countries with nutrients and footprints, and then we started modeling. And when we did this modeling, we came to the following results. And here on the horizontal axis, you see the greenhouse gas emissions as an indicator of the environmental sustainability of the diet. It starts with 100%, the current level, and that should be lower, so the actual axis is from current values to lower values. But the more to the right, the better it is. And on the vertical axis, we have the nutrient density a measure of nutrient density, the nutrient-rich diet score, proposed by Drunovsky, as a summary measure of the nutritional quality of the diet. And then we said, okay, if we start at a diet, current diet at 100%, we could, in the green area in the figure before, we could look what are the diets that are healthier but as close as possible to our current habits. And that's what we call the maximum preferable diet. The least possible changes to arrive at a healthier diet. And then as a second step, we said, let's look at what would be the dietary choices if you go to a maximum healthy diet in terms of nutrient density. That's the black max H diet. Or if you would go from this preferable diet to a maximum sustainable diet with the lowest greenhouse gas emissions. And you see that there are different ways to go from a healthier diet, which we still prefer reasonably, to a maximum sustainable or maximum healthy diet. They score differently on greenhouse gas and on nutrient scores. And these black figures, the figures in black, reflect when we use peers as an example within a country. But when we would allow people from Denmark to choose a diet as they use in Italy and the other way around, or when we would allow Czech people to eat like French people or the other way around, say, okay, you can choose any person who eats better than you do anywhere in these 4 countries, and you could expand then that theoretically to the world in total, then you come to the blue figures, and then you see that you can make bigger gains in the health of the diet and bigger gains in sustainability and the preferability, and you also need to make some differences. And then we compare this to the Eat Lancet diet, how that scored on these. And then you see that the Eat Lancet diet does better on the greenhouse gas emission, but it does it does better for the sustainability. But with respect to the health, the nutrient density, it scores similar to what we could reach by just looking to our peers within our countries, or our looking at European peers would even do better. So for health, we need not change that much as we would need to change for arriving at a sustainable diet. Now, 10 minutes, right? And that implies that we should realize that the Eat Lancet diet and our analysis makes use of the current greenhouse gas emissions as they are with the food, as they are based on the way we have arranged, organized, or how the food system is organized in today. And of course, there are a number of initiatives ongoing to make our food production system more sustainable as well. And when that happens, the sustainability of our diets will increase without changing dietary choices. So the max S figures will go to the right automatically, and the max health will also go a bit to the right. And if we would account for reducing energy intake, it will also go to the right. So we might achieve more gains in sustainability than this figure suggests when we also consider that the food system and the production system is going to change in the future. But it also shows that we cannot, it's unlikely that we can completely make the shift to healthy diets by only dietary changes. And when we focus on health, we arrive at different diets when we focus on sustainability. Of course, you would like to know how do these different diets look like. And we have called these the benchmark diets, for benchmarking for preferability, health, or sustainability. And here on the left, you see an example of the amounts of food from different food groups in our observed diets, where we use either the country-specific boundaries of change, peers within the countries, or when we use the Europe-wide, or when we would use the Eat Lancet diet. And then you'll see, when you look at the lower part, that's the dark brown area, which is the whole grains. And you'll see then that they increase when we go to a more preferable or a more healthy and a more sustainable diet, but they increase even more when we go to a European-wide diet, when we allow that type of changes, but Eat Lancet goes much further. And when we have seen before that our diets are as healthy as the Eat Lancet diet, but maybe not yet as sustainable, then we should see whether some of these trade-offs are realistic for the Western European situation. And of course, I would love to see how figures like this would look like for Asia, for China, etc. You also see that the green part in these figures tends to increase when you go from observed diets to maximum preferable healthy or sustainable diets, which indicates that indeed more fruits, vegetables, legumes, etc. And you also see that the blue part is in the models that we used for Europe, that the blue part, which relates to milk, including cheese, that it's also about the same for European diets, but it is decreased in the Eat Lancet diet. And this might have to do with issues like how it fits into the culture, because we have used our own peers in Europe as examples. But it also shows that it is possible to have those diets with these amounts, healthy and sustainable diets with these amounts of milk products in it. And you also see that the red part in all these bars is shrinking when you go from left to right, and the most so for the Eat Lancet diet. And that's because we have to eat less ruminant meat, according to this model, less animal foods, and also to use less alcohol, which comes quite clear out of these analyses. Well, when you look at this in a bit more detail, and this is an example taken from another data set, you could look at the contribution of certain food groups to nutrient intakes, because we want to avoid that we run into certain problems with these diets when we are going to change our diet in the future. And here I have the example of contribution of different food groups to a number of vitamins and minerals. And then you see that milk and dairy contribute quite a lot to vitamin B12, B9, calcium, of course, but also potassium and some other ones. But these are the B12 and calcium are quite important. And these are indeed, if you would look at a global scale, nutrients that might become at stake if we go to very low meat or diets, or diets with very low amounts of animal products. And then milk could be a solution for some of the countries. And that's because white meat, fish and eggs are relevant to both B12, but also to something like selenium in some of the countries. So that brings me to almost the end of my presentation, some concluding remarks. So what are the key messages? Well, it says here eat less calories, but I would say prevent overweight, because that will also reduce the emissions to reduce the environmental burden. But we need to be careful whether we imply this as a fixed recommendation for all people in a population. Our analysis, and we have seen so far, are for adults, and we have to take care of vulnerable groups in the population. Think about elderly, who are maybe less hungry, but where also bioavailability of a number of micronutrients may be reduced, so they have a higher need for higher intakes because of that. People with high physical activity may have higher needs for certain proteins, but also children who are in the growth phase might have higher needs. So these diet recommendations, yes, they are fine for adults, but they may be different. Results of such an analysis might be different for children, elderly, or physically very active people. Second, most analyses indeed support that we need to shift from ruminant meat to pork, chicken, fish, and increase plant foods. But there is still room. We need to be aware of the intakes of vitamin B12, calcium, and zinc, which points at the relevance of dairy, but there may also be other solutions for the diet, but dairy at least could provide a lot of these nutrients. Third, it's clear that sustainable nutrition is not only about the quantity of foods we eat, but also the quality, so the food composition. But when we talk about quality, it's not only about the quality of the type of foods we eat, the quality with respect to nutrients and with respect to the life cycle assessment or the environmental burden. It's also quality in terms of social disparities, the global social disparities, the affordability, and the quality with respect to the consumer, the acceptability, the taste, the preferences, etc. So that part, which is hard to model, as I said, and where we use this peer or benchmarking approach to accommodate for that to some extent. And finally, this transition to green proteins involves the diet as a whole. And what I want to say with that is that we should not only frame the diet, the transition that is needed to arrive at healthy and sustainable diet as a protein transition, but frame it as a diet transition. And therefore we need to monitor very carefully from now on and in the future what the effects will be on nutrient adequacy, and we need to think about a more central role of the consumer as a key actor in the food system. So in conclusion, my view on the whole issue of sustainable and healthy diet is that yes, it's the food system, that's the production system that brings the food to our table, but we need to be aware that the consumer as a person or as a family or as a community, there's also a big influence of us as human beings to make our own choices in a healthy and sustainable way, so that we can feed the 9 to 10 billion people in 2050 and maintain their physical, mental and social well-being, but at the same time transform the food system toward a system that's nationally and globally sustainable. With this, I formally have to thank all the people who have contributed to the work that I've presented in this webinar. So I think I pleased them with just showing their logos, which is not so interesting for you. But I thank you for your attention. Thank you for participating in this webinar. And to close, I would like to point you to some practical information for those who want to receive accreditation or an attendance certificate. You have to fill in the evaluation form that you will receive by email later today. And I want to make clear that the text of this recording of the webinar will also be available to you next week via the link that you see here indicated. And if you have any further questions on this webinar or the contents of it, you can either go to some of the links or a reference I have given, but you can also contact the FrieslandCampina Institute by the email account given here. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to present my views on healthy and sustainable diets for Europe and for the globe. And I thank you for your interest from all over the globe to participate in this webinar.